Hello, and welcome to this STEM video tutorial. This video tutorial will cover what a STEM interactive notebook is and how to use it in your classroom. This tutorial is not designed to introduce students to using a STEM interactive notebook. You can find a PowerPoint in our Oakcliff STEM Outlook group that will walk your students through setting up their notebooks. This tutorial is specifically for teachers. Before we get into setting up and using STEM notebooks in your classroom, let's talk a little bit about what they are. STEM notebooks are intended to be a complete reference for students to use as they work on any STEM challenge or STEM burst. As such, any lessons, content knowledge, or information they will need in order to answer their STEM real-world problem should be contained in this one notebook. For example, if students will need to create an invoice for the materials they will use to build their solution to a problem, then the math lessons, such as how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, should be in here. If they will be writing to persuade the PTA or a partner to use their solution, the lessons on how to organize persuasive writing should be in here. STEM notebooks have a teacher side and a student side to allow students a place to keep the content delivered by the teacher, but also have a place to put things in their own words, to demonstrate their own understandings, and to create their own content and solutions to problems. STEM notebooks should be a source of pride for our students that they want to look back through and even show to others to see all that they have learned and accomplished. Now that we've talked a little bit about what a STEM interactive notebook is, let's look at what goes inside one. The first thing we should see when we open up a STEM interactive notebook is a table of contents. The table of contents becomes very important when we understand that this is to be a reference for students to go back into when they need the information to solve a part of their problem. So for example, if they need to know how to multiply decimals to create their invoice, then they want to be able to get directly to the page that shows them how to do that. Keeping the table of contents up to date throughout the year will really facilitate students using them in this way. Usually we have students label 6 pages as table of contents, and again, you'll find that in the actual PowerPoint that we use with the children, that we use with the students to set up their interactive notebooks. But for most purposes, 6 pages usually will cover an entire year worth of content. Once they do that, they begin numbering odd and even pages, with odd numbers being on the left and even numbered pages on the right. This will turn into your teacher side and your student side. The teacher side will always be the right side, or the even side pages, and the student side will always be the left side, or the odd numbered pages. So what are the first few lessons that need to go in our STEM interactive notebooks? Well, pretty much every year we should teach the same 3 lessons before we get started on anything else. This teaches them STEM concepts, or the STEM literacy skills that they're going to need throughout the year. These don't really need to be in any specific order, but the first 3 should be: what is technology, what is an engineer, and the steps for the Oakcliff engineering design process. So the next question often is, well, what do I put in the STEM notebook and what goes in something else? How do I know whether it belongs in the STEM notebook? Well, content from all subject areas needs to go in the STEM notebook, but it's only the content that will align with your STEM challenge unit or your STEM burst. So in other words, if you are teaching a grammar lesson and the grammar does not align with your STEM unit, then it's not going to go in this notebook. However, if they need to add up 5 popsicle sticks and then they are going to ask for another 3 popsicle sticks and you need them to tell you how many popsicle sticks they need altogether, then addition is going to need to go in this notebook. Another example for language arts would be if you are in narrative writing and you are studying the life cycle of butterflies, and you are going to have your students write a narrative story from the perspective of a butterfly going through its life cycle, then the organization and writing skills that are needed for them to write that story need to go in your STEM notebook. However, if you're teaching a phonics lesson, it doesn't really need to go in your STEM notebook. Sample problems or example problems or sample sentences can go in the STEM notebook, but homework, drill and practice, or, for example, 10 problems should not go in the STEM notebook. It winds up cluttering up the pages and it makes it hard for students to find the lessons that they need to solve their problem because they have to rummage through pages and pages of classwork or homework. As your students work in their STEM notebooks, you're going to find some work you really are pleased with and you're going to want to give them grades. And that's okay to a point, but we never grade directly in the STEM notebook, and we always try to keep it positive. The last thing we want is for students to become ashamed of these books. So grades, if they're taken, should always be ones that we're sure that most children are going to be completely successful with. For example, completion grades. And these do not get written in the STEM notebook. In fact, the teacher never really should write in a child's STEM notebook for any reason. These notebooks belong to them. If you want to put positive feedback in a STEM notebook, we recommend you do so on a sticky note, so that if the child doesn't want others to see that commentary, they can remove it. Also, given the collaborative nature of STEM units, children will often have to have their STEM notebook open where other children can see, and we would want to protect their privacy by not having grades or written feedback in their notebooks. Here are some common questions that teachers have about STEM notebooks. What if a child puts something on the wrong side? That's going to happen. Ideally, before you begin a lesson, you remind them which side what kind of content goes on. But if a mistake happens, let it go. A gentle reminder that maybe next time they could put that kind of information on the left side or right side, respectively. But don't make them cross it off, and certainly don't make them tear it out. Imagine how this student would feel if we made her cross off or tear out that beautiful frog that she's drawn on the right side, just because it's on the right side. So how should we have children correct mistakes that they make? The STEM notebooks need to be a complete picture of the challenge, including all of their productive failures and the little mistakes that happen. That's a part of the journey. So we want that stuff to stay in there. But sometimes it can either really bother a child, or we don't really want a misconception in front of them all of the time for them to remember the wrong way. So they can put a line through a mistake, or if it's a small mistake, they can erase it if they want to. What we want to avoid is them saying that an entire idea was bad or wrong. We want to really avoid that. Students need to understand that mistakes are a part of the process and that they're valuable to look back on. So absolutely never have them tear out a page, never have them erase an entire page, or scribble through something as if it were bad or terrible. A simple single line through a mistake is more than sufficient. And if it really bothers them to have the mistake in there, they can always write a little statement next to it saying, "Oh, here's where I was confused, and this is what I've learned from it." Always in a reflective way, though, never in a punitive way. Another common question is, should I limit how many pages students use for a topic, or what page a topic should start or end on? The important thing to remember is that STEM notebooks belong to the students. We try not to limit them any more than necessary. As a result, some kids may use a small space for the same content that another child will use a larger space. And because of that, we're never really going to be able to tell them specifically what page to start new content on. It's going to be different for every child, and that's the way it should be. So here are some guidelines. You can always tell them to turn to the next blank right side page if it's teacher content you're about to give them. Or you can ask them to turn to the next blank left side page if it's student-generated content they're about to create. Also, it's important to remember that right and left pages don't have to sync up unless you want them to for a specific reason. So for example, a student may generate a plant cell drawing on the left-hand side and have no teacher content for the right-hand side. Or they may generate teacher content and not have a drawing or student content for the left-hand side. Alternatively, a student may have math content that was taught in class on the right-hand side, but they still have the leftover pages from their 3-page story that they wrote about a seedling's life cycle on the left-hand side. If you do need content to sync up, in other words, you're going to teach a vocabulary lesson on the right-hand side and you want them to draw or write their own understanding of the vocabulary on the left-hand side, then simply tell them to turn to the next blank right and left pages. It's also important to note that subject area material does not need to be contiguous. In other words, if you start a language arts lesson on Monday and the science teacher teaches something on Tuesday, and you continue your language arts lesson on Wednesday, and so the science material is in between the language arts material, that's absolutely okay. Here's a good example of this. The child on the left likes to do full-page drawings. So their animal cell on the left lines up with the teaching about the cell organelles on the right. But by the time they got to their plant cell, there wasn't any more teacher content. So the plant cell winds up being opposite a blank page. On the right-hand side, you can see here's a child that drew both cells small enough to fit on one page. And so they're both opposite the teacher content about the cell organelles. Both of them are absolutely fine. As I mentioned, there may be times where you do need the 2 pages to line up. In this case, the teacher wanted to give the vocabulary for mixtures and solutions on the right-hand side, and then wanted the student to draw or illustrate their own understanding of the concepts on the left-hand side. and they wanted them to be able to see the two side by side. So in this case, the teacher simply said, turn to the next blank right and left page, and here's where we're going to begin our content. Another common question is, can I include printouts, templates, or graphic organizers on the teacher's side? And the short answer to this really is only if you absolutely have to. As a general rule, this is frowned upon. This should be student-created material. This should not be printouts that they glue in. Now, in some cases, you may have to rely on a printout to help a child be successful. But always ask yourself, is there any way this child can create this content themselves? If the answer is yes, then you should not use the printout. Certainly printouts like the illustration on this slide are a no-no. Very little here is student-generated at all. Ways that you can make it easier for students to create their own content and not have to have a printout glued in is to try putting a word bank on the wall or on the board so that students can copy difficult words down. Also, allow for spelling errors. So long as you can make out what they're trying to say, it's okay if it isn't spelled perfectly. Also, for younger students, you can allow them to illustrate their concepts instead of writing them in words. As a rule, student-generated content is always preferable. Here are some examples. On the left-hand side, the student is given a graphic organizer that lays out exactly where and how big each section should be. There's very little room for creativity, and this is very limiting. The student on the right has generated the exact same information, but they had the freedom to write as much as they needed to explain their thinking or to draw an illustration that shows what their thinking is. One is limiting, the other one allows for creativity. Here's an example of an appropriate use of a printout. In this case, a template is needed to create the foldable, but all the template provides is the basic shapes so that the wheels line up. The student generates all of the content within the shapes. This is another example of an appropriate use of a template for a younger child. The template allows for a large space for creative drawing and illustration of concepts and gives structured lines for students who are just learning how to write. But as you can see, all of the content is student-generated. The template simply makes it easier for the children to write and draw. Here's an example of a template that could be okay to use depending on the needs of your child. This template would be completely inappropriate for students that are capable of writing the labels themselves, or even for those that could copy the words if they were written on a word wall or on the board. This template would be okay to use for students that are not capable of writing even if they can copy the words, because the big panels still leave lots of room for students to create their own thoughts and ideas. But again, I wouldn't use this with older children at all. Finally, by having students create all of the content themselves, you leave a lot of room for creativity. Even on the teacher's side, they may want to use color to highlight words, or maybe they want to use text features like boxes and shading to make concepts more clear for them. Here's an example of a first grade content lesson where the teacher provided the words on the board and gave an example of how to split into the 4 boxes, but the students did it themselves. So the words for the seasons are spelled correctly, but there's some misspelling in the top part. And that's okay. That's to be expected for first graders. But they really can generate this content themselves. Another question teachers often have once they start using interactive notebooks is, how do I tell what goes on the teacher side and what goes on the student side? And at first that may seem like that should be obvious, but it really gets quite blurry as you go along. Here are some general guidelines to go by. As a general rule, on the teacher side, you will put anything that you're going to write on the board or that they're going to copy from a web page or from a textbook or from any other source. That's going to go on the right-hand teacher side because that's not their own thoughts and words. Problem statements, our asks, those should generally go on the right-hand side if you give them the problem statement word for everyone to copy down. If you allow them to put the problem statement in their own words, then it would go on the left-hand side. Materials lists that are going to be exactly the same for every group should go on the right-hand side. But if children get to choose from that list and then they create their own materials list with only the materials that they have chosen, that would go on the left-hand side. Vocabulary words. Again, if they're copying down words and definitions from a book or a board or a website, then that will go on the right-hand side. But if they're going to define the words in their own terms, or if they're going to write sentences as examples that are their own, then that would go on the left-hand side. Math concepts can be a little confusing too. If you're going to give them an example problem and everyone's going to write down the exact same example problem, that will go on the right-hand side. But if you have them create their own sample problem, then that would go on the left-hand side. That's the end of our content for this video today. I hope this clarified some of the questions you may have about using STEM interactive notebooks in your classroom. The most important thing is don't be afraid to use them. If mistakes happen, that's fine. It's much better to have them actively being used with mistakes than be so afraid of them not being perfect that you never start using them. Thanks for watching.